Foundation Source is happy to welcome you to this webinar. Our topic today is the many facets of family philanthropy. Before we get started, please note a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions at any time during this webinar, please drop them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. If we're not able to address all the questions in this session, we will follow up after this webinar with our responses. Closed captioning is available, and this webinar is being recorded. You'll receive a follow-up email with the recording sometime after this session. We've had a slight change in plans as Elizabeth Wong, head of Foundation Source's Philanthropic Advisory Services, is not able to join us today. I'm Robin Houlihan, Senior Philanthropic Director. Foundation Source provides comprehensive support services to more than 2,400 private foundations. We know from our clients that they are both excited and anxious about engaging the next generation of their families into their giving. We're excited to delve into multiple sides of this subject. And we are so glad to be joined by our guest, Miki Akimoto, Chief Impact Officer from the National Center for Family Philanthropy, or NCFP. Miki brings a wide range of experience in philanthropic sector, including roles at Bank of America, Philanthropy Massachusetts, and the Annie Casey Foundation. Welcome, Miki, and thank you for joining us today. So let's jump in. Our discussion today will focus on family philanthropy and engaging the next generation in family giving. Foundation Source's 2024 survey of its clients revealed that a striking number, approximately 70%, will undertake involving the next generation in their giving in the year ahead. This, against the backdrop that older generations in the United States are estimated to hold $72 trillion in wealth that will be transferred to younger generations in the next decade, reinforces the timeliness of our discussion. And although engaging the next generation into family philanthropy might appear to be a shared theme, we also recognize the wide range among our family foundation clients, calling for flexible, customized, and multifaceted approaches to their questions in common. So let's begin with the range of types, sizes, and approaches that families take in their giving. There is not a single homogeneous model. Our goal is to adapt best practices to a family's own practice. Our work is in bringing together sector expertise and working with our clients to adapt these to the needs and interests of their family. So Miki, let's start out with the range of approaches to family philanthropy that you're seeing among NCFP members.
Thanks, Robin, and thanks for having me here. It's always a delight to partner with Foundation Source. I think what you're raising and what you raised in the intro is such an important point. There is no single model. What we are seeing are models that are as varied as the families that exist across our society. At the same time, we're certainly seeing some patterns and we're seeing some themes. And so, as you note, there is a significant movement towards involving the next generation. And so if we think about points of inflections in a foundation's or a philanthropy's life, there are questions and decisions that have to happen at those moments of inflection. So we see families grappling with questions of bringing on that next generation. And in doing so, how are you addressing issues of accountability? How are you accountable to each other as family members? And how then are you collectively as a family accountable to the communities and grantees you're partnering with? There are questions of equity, again, internal and external. How are you making sure that there is parity among generations in terms of power structures within governance, in terms of people truly having an opportunity to exercise their voice? At the same time, again, equity and how are you thinking about your resource allocations? How are you making your grants? There's a great moment here for stepping back and doing reflection and learning. How are you now, in bringing on this next generation, really going to be thoughtful about learning together, thinking together, and as you're learning, redefining and thinking about your philanthropic purpose? What is your North Star going to be? Because without that shared sense of purpose, that's something that you really have to take on. And finally, as ever in family philanthropy, there's questions of relationships. How are you really tackling relationships, again, internally and externally? And so out of those questions, out of those decisions, we're seeing a range of things from people starting new foundations, people using donor advised funds, people thinking about questions of spending down or spending up. Is the old model of we're going to exist in perpetuity forever still the right fit for our moment in time? So I think that's a too long don't read, version of there's a lot of different models, but the exciting part of that is there's so much opportunity.
I'd like to touch a little bit later, especially on that learning aspect, but first want to jump into maybe what's the highs and lows of family giving. There's so many approaches, and there are a few things that might get in the way of even deciding on those approaches that I'd like to touch on first. We mentioned earlier that engaging the next generation in the family's giving is top of mind for our clients.
Mhm.
So this same topic ranks very high on the list of stressors for family foundations. There are incredible benefits, obviously, to family giving. There's modeling family generosity, sharing a family's legacy, witnessing together the impact of philanthropic support on the community, enjoying the rewards of making a difference with your resources, learning the craft of operating within the nonprofit sector, and developing professional skills. That could be financial management, organizational development, critical analysis, but there's also challenges. There's plenty of examples where the founder, that first generation or G1, is passing on their foundation to their children or G2 and members of G2, and they don't see eye to eye. They're not agreeing necessarily on how to take that foundation forward. Sometimes the friction comes from something as logistical as who has more time to devote to philanthropy, and whether the people who are busy are comfortable relinquishing some of the control to their less busy family members. So Miki, can you talk to us a little bit about some of the situations that NCFP has encountered where there's friction? What are some of the solutions that you've proposed? What have you seen work? What hasn't worked? And what might you have done in those situations that moves it along a little bit?
So I want to start by saying, of course, that there's no one particular thing that's going to solve generational friction, because if we had figured that out, we'd all, be in a much better world than we are. But that being said, I think there's a couple of things that we've seen in the families that we've worked with and families that I worked with when I was doing other roles, which is that question of time is really a critical one. And sometimes what that takes is a stepping back and saying, what really needs to get done and who needs to do it? Because there's going to be assumption, particularly if you have a founding generation that maybe isn't working full time anymore or has the ability to put a lot more time into the things, that there's an assumption that certain, say, administrative tasks have to be done by family members. And the question is that really true? Could you outsource some of the things that you think the family has to do to other people, freeing up the family members to onboard and really take on more strategic questions and do that learning around the topical areas in which the foundation funds, which can have a couple of different benefits? Because if you're really taking the time that you're asking the next generation to learn together, to think about the impact of the grant making together, that's just at the end of the day going to feel more rewarding than making sure that all the paperwork's in order, right? Or that you're compiling grant applications to be reviewed. So I think that sometimes it's that question of stepping back and just assessing the field and saying, how are we spending the time now? Does it have to be spent in that way? Or are there other solutions? That's one. I saw one family, for example, that had been in a very heavily paper-based environment, and there were literally boxes and boxes in someone's living room of old grant applications that someone was compiling and mailing out to every family member. They went to an online grants management system where everyone could just look at the stuff on the portal. Grantees just had to submit, something, upload. The grantees weren't having to, mail in 12 sets of paper applications. So everybody won. People got back time. People felt more engaged. Some of the younger generation actually took on the task of figuring out which online platform to use. And that was how they built some of their skills in assessing what's going to fit best for our family. So that's one thing I think that can happen. I think the other thing in terms of that friction that you referenced is values. And we certainly hear a lot in the popular media. We hear a lot, I think, maybe an anecdote of families having friction. What we actually see, though, if we look at some of the surveys that we've done with our members, if we look at some of the conversations we're having, is there's less friction than is sometimes evident. That families are, in fact, often highly aligned on values. But what we do see sometimes is that different generations are using different words to describe those same values or same interests. And so there, what we've sometimes seen being very useful is bringing in an outside facilitator to help hold that conversation and to literally translate terms and ideas across generations and help people recognize that there's much more of an overlap in those values and interests than you might think from the outset. So I'm going to stop there with those couple ideas.
Yeah, and I love that only because we do it quite often in our roles, but the outside facilitator is terrific in serving as kind of that neutral party,
Mhm.
and puts everybody more on that level playing field at the table and takes the family hat off, right? And puts
Yeah.
on the foundation hat and just is there to remind everybody that we're all there for kind of the common goal
Mhm.
of giving. So yeah, very useful. Thank you. I'd like to check in a little bit on what family needs and what constitutes a family. So as families begin to contemplate who to engage in their giving, they're often asked what constitutes family. It's a question that can vary so widely. Both the phase of giving and a family's size can dramatically influence this topic, as you know, where the primary decision makers are young wealth creators, sometimes with small children. Sometimes there's no other family members to engage, and it's simply up to the two members of the family to make the decision and chart the course forward. And then there's the large multi-generational families, and we can be talking about hundreds of family members, right? That's when it helps to be clear about what constitutes family when it comes to the family's giving. Is it everyone in the family tree? Is it spouses, no spouses? Those are hard conversations sometimes. And being open about this question is, I think, an important first step. We found that it's good to have this conversation early on. So I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about what variations that you've found on this front.
I will certainly do that. And I will also say that that question's an important question, but an equally, if not more important question is whose voices do you need to make good decisions? Because really, at the end of the day, what you're talking about is governance. And so you start by this question of what is the purpose of your philanthropy? What are you trying to accomplish? And that can have internal and external goals. You could have internal goals around family involvement, using this as a platform or a vehicle to keep generations together over the course of time. But you also have an external goal about the difference you're trying to make in the world. And so there's a couple of different questions I think that we're unpacking in this what is family question, because what we see more and more is that families are moving away from the assumption that it's family only, and that you have this question about what the role of the family is in family philanthropy, and then you have to have a decision about what that family means. But also, if you think about it's family philanthropy, so whose voices do you need to really accomplish that philanthropy? So let me start with the family question first, and then talk about the philanthropy question. So from a family perspective, we're seeing everything from it's lineal descendants only to it is spouses to it is a much broader definition of found family or close-in friends that are family-like or are considered family. So it can be that whole set of concentric circles. And we also see that evolving over time as generations come on and develop their own family structures, and those may look different than the founding family's structure.
Mhm.
But again, as I said, increasingly families are saying, what is the family viewpoint that we want carried forward, but then who are the right people to carry that viewpoint and impact forward. And that may mean bringing on members of the community who have an expertise in the issue that you're trying to solve, or really know the neighborhoods deeply where you're doing the work.
Mhm.
And so I think as you think about this in asking the question, you do need at some point to say, like, who are we going to count as family? And importantly, also, who else do we need at the table or may need at the table in some way or another to make the best and smartest decision?
So it's interesting you bring that up, because what we're finding is that things are shifting a little bit, depending on the generation that might be involved.
Mhm.
And so to have this conversation, and when I say shifting, I mean who might be the decision maker at the table. So when you are in transition, it's almost like you're starting over in a way when you're changing that leadership, perhaps when another generation is coming in. You don't just ask the question once. I think it's good to just keep asking that question. As you said, values might be different, approaches might be different. Engaging the community is definitely a different approach. And so with different participants, we have seen that you bring in a new family member and they're saying, I want an expert at the table. I want somebody from the community, when that's never been done before. So it's a question to start over again about what it means, right? Um,
Absolutely. And I
yeah.
think a lot of family philanthropy is iterative because it's you're going through different generational cycles. Your philanthropy is evolving as you're working in an area for a certain period of time. Your understanding of what issues need or may take for solving or moving forward is also going to evolve and grow. And so I think this is one of the great opportunities to keep learning, to keep evolving, to build on what you're learning in order to have greater impact in the world.
So we've talked about what constitutes family, but let's get a little bit more specific and talk about who's eligible to participate in the family philanthropy. Um, Age matters here for some foundations,
Mhm.
and a family, for many foundations actually, and in certain degrees in being a voting member at the table, age definitely matters. A family may establish some different age thresholds for different levels of participation. For example, starting at age 12, some foundations have their children issue grant certificates, which is a foundation source offering that we enable a designated person to nominate an organization for a specified amount of support. And the decision makers actually retain the ability to approve that recommendation. In a similar vein, families may determine that at the age of 25 years old, family members are eligible to serve on the board and be voting members of a family foundation board. Preferences can also range from including only direct descendants of founders or considering spouses as part of the pool, for people who can participate. And this varies depending on the tool that the family foundation employs. So with a private foundation, participation can range from um, deploying that grant certificate to doing program specific advisory committee work to formally serving on a board. And with other tools, the conversations about where to deploy philanthropic resources, can they be more informal, take place at the dinner table, for example, rather than the boardroom table. So can you talk a little bit about the different methods for determining eligibility to engage in the family philanthropy, um, that NCFP members have employed over time?
Absolutely. And I think some of the things you've already mentioned is there can be some very objective criteria around age. I've also seen some families have sort of volunteer requirements that you need to be volunteering with a nonprofit. And what we've found are the families that have most successfully engaged the next gen are those that have definitive criteria that make it clear that serving on the board is a privilege and opportunity, not a right. And by that, I mean foundations that just say, any lineal descendant can and will serve or is optional to serve can get themselves in a little bit of trouble. The other model that we've seen to be less successful is one that has strict branch representation, meaning that you might have the G1 generation with, hypothetically, let's say, three G2 second generation siblings, and there's a certain number of seats allocated to each line of descent. That has not proven to be a particularly successful model, because then it feels, depending on how many descendants there are out of each one of those branches, there can be a lot of jockeying for position, and that can be challenging. What we have found is most successful is setting up criteria where it's really going back to that question I raised earlier about whose voices and expertise do we need to make decisions. And so it's sort of setting criteria that may say, starting at age 21, 25, pick a number. 25 seems to be very popular for some reason. You are eligible, but then you have to demonstrate an interest. You may have to serve some time on an advisory committee first, or do a certain number of site visits. Another family I know of set an educational criteria that said you had to do 8 hours of philanthropic education through webinars, through attending a conference, through something else, and the family would pay for that education. But you had to demonstrate your interest by putting some time in to learn about the field before you started. And then providing pathways into that engagement where people can test it out, really understand what they're getting to. We've seen families develop formal curricula where you're learning about the history of the family's foundation or giving, and then you're demonstrating that your interest through engagement in some way. You may spend an apprenticeship reviewing proposals or something else. The other critical thing, interestingly enough, is creating off-ramps. We did a series of interviews recently with adult next generation family members who've been involved in their family's philanthropy. And one of the themes that came in was it's important to invite people in, not just appoint them, and to provide opportunities to flow in and out of engagement as the circumstances of your life change. One of the young people said that at 25, she was sat down and told she was now on the board of the family foundation. And her exact expression was that it felt like a life sentence, that it was something she'd been handed without really checking if this is something she wanted. And so I think this is where it's so critical to think about models of engagement that are right-sized for your family, your ability to support sort of learning and other opportunities, but also recognize that people's lives shift and change, and that you may not be able to start at 25 and last until you're 65.
I want to expound on a few things that you just said. One is the educational piece, and it kind of moves into that off-ramp concept. Really glad you brought that up. To really give a potential philanthropic participant an understanding of what it's going to be like to serve on a board or be a part of family philanthropy. It's so important to have all those opportunities to really experience it, maybe before you say yes, or before you land on that board. So I love that the curriculum, the educational sessions on whether it's nonprofit sector and how our foundation fits in, or something a little more specific, like rules of governance, or what does grant making mean? What are all the different approaches? But some of the others that we've seen successful is shadowing, or having a mentor, like having a foundation board member or one of the officers. For example, we have a client where the treasurer brought on a young philanthropist, very interested in finance and really wanted to understand all the financial aspects of what a foundation was about, and shadowed for about a year before deciding whether this was something that he would like to pursue. And then the other one, when you mentioned that off-ramp and that example of somebody feeling like a life sentence, another approach, and I think you did mention advisory board, is a junior board. Something where it's just there's different ways to do that. It could be where we've had a client that provides a portfolio and they're actually making decisions on a portfolio amount. Or it could be a junior board of doing, as you said, the site visits and test driving pursuing interests and making recommendations to the board and just experiencing all those processes. And perhaps, as you said, working with a professional might be helpful in doing something like that. But going back to that education piece, so important.
I think that, and to your point, that exposure before you make the full commitment. And the other thing I would really pitch on a junior board or some kind of association like that is I'm thinking about a family I know where individual younger family members were given the opportunity to make recommendations for small grants. They could nominate their local zoo or their, favorite children's charity, but they were also as a group given a much larger pool of money compared to their individual grants on which they had to work together to make a single recommendation. And I thought that was so smart because part of being on a board, as I think many people know, is learning how to be in that give and take, how to disagree respectfully and come to a consensus, come to a conclusion together. And so I think building those muscles of how to engage in discourse, how to, tangle with an idea, wrestle with different opposing views, and then come out in the middle somewhere is such an important skill to develop as a young person coming onto a board, a workplace, anywhere.
Right, right. Maybe starting with a few ground rules is always
Always a good
helpful.
idea.
So we've talked about what we mean by family and delve deeper into eligibility to participate. What about the next step, asking people to engage in the family giving? So when foundation leaders are considering opening the foundation to new members of the family, it's important to be clear about what you're asking. So are you inviting family to join the foundation in its current configuration to do things the way they've always been done, kind of my way or the highway? Or is there now, or will there be in the future room for them to add their voices to the mix and potentially influence policies and approaches, and if so, how? So Miki, it'd be great if you could talk about some of the examples of this transition that you've seen, perhaps in both camps. Come do this our way, the way it's always been done, and join us. We want a fresh perspective, and we're open to change.
Well, I think you've laid out the continuum quite well, that there are certainly circumstances where you're being invited to change. And I think the more dangerous situation at the my way or the highway end of the spectrum are those situations where you're being invited in. And I see this particularly with third generation. By the time you get down to that sort of cousin generation, you're being invited in and you get into your first full board meeting and realize, oh, actually, the culture of this board is that we go along with grandpa's decision, and that there's this false sense of consensus, this false sense of having agency. And so I think this is also part of, in making the invitations, are people being really self-aware about what you're inviting somebody into? Because I think we've all gotten in situations where we think it's one thing and it turns out to be another thing. And so what we see is that invitation into what feels like, oh, we're inviting you to bring your voice, but then you get in the room and you realize, oh, my voice is not actually welcome, that's an amazingly bad opportunity for people to just disengage and say, well, I don't really going to care about this. I don't really know that I need to be involved in this. On the flip side, I think those invitations where you're truly being invited in are exciting. But also I think it's building the right on-ramps again, and for the inviting generation to be patient and recognize that someone's not going to be able to jump in full bore in their first board meeting and propose new policies, and sort of thinking about what is the on-ramp, what is the learning curve that people need to go through, what are the materials and supports. To your point, there could have been a board buddy, there can be some learning opportunities. There's definitely ways of engaging people where people feel ready to take on that full-fledged role of a co-equal board member in a foundation. So I think there's that, and it's really planning in advance. And so I think it's opening conversations long before you're inviting people in. You don't want your first conversation to be, hey, there's a board meeting next month, we'd like you to come be there. How have you as a family been talking about the foundation or the philanthropic giving vehicle? How are you preparing people to think about how are you being transparent in your dinner table conversations about how you go about thinking about the grant making. So it's making sure that you're preparing the ground ahead of time, I think.
Right. And I kind of gave two scenarios for you to comment on, which is the my way or, fresh perspective, but there always is that hybrid option too. I mean, I've certainly seen with a few generations down, as you mentioned, when you get to G3, there's sometimes this deep curiosity about, grandpa's history and
Mhm.
grandmom's values and why were they interested in this and a real eagerness to understand and kind of emulate and respect and honor some of those deep-seated interests that have trickled down through the generations to where they are today. And so there is an interest to continue with the original intent, but then there's the fresh voice, and there's with every generation, there's new challenges that they're facing and new opportunities to make an impact and have a voice in the community. And so we've seen a lot of foundations who are successful in doing both. So honoring a legacy, but also making room for the next generation to have their own voice exercised and utilized in a way that's heard and feels inclusive. And sometimes there's ways to marry the two, where it might be a subject matter or an approach, but the next generation might just have a different angle of seeing it and how solutions can happen.
I would definitely agree. And I think as we were talking about earlier about the iterative nature of philanthropy and the need to revisit critical questions periodically, in inviting in the next generation, that can often be an amazing moment to stop and say, let's go back to our basics. Our current vision statement is this, our current mission statement is this. But let's reassess that. How are you understanding that? And let's unpack, which is also a great moment to look at the history. Like, how do we get here? And does this still serve us as a family and the communities that we're serving in this moment? And often the answer is a resounding yes, but it is often also a yes and. This is still serving us, and this is the spin we need to look at now. This is where we are now. These are the issues that the next generation is interested in. And so how do we stop and step back and say, all right, how do we move together with a common understanding of what it is that we're trying to accomplish? And how do we also think about how that aligns back to our own values?
Exactly. And that's a frequent conversation. I mean, usually check-ins might be once a year or so at an annual meeting. Just start with the mission statement and you know, check in on that alignment. And, just have the conversation, not necessarily deep, but it might be an offshoot to side conversations about, oh, I've got some other ideas here. Can we talk about it and have some offline conversations before making it a more formal discussion?
Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you, Miki. This has been a really interesting conversation. I love your sharing insights from the field. I'm walking away from this conversation with a few takeaways in mind, some points that stand out. First, most importantly, start family philanthropy with your eyes wide open. Um, there's a lot of rewarding and joyful reasons to incorporate family into your giving practice, but there can also be compromises and challenges possibly. So as a useful starting point, I think we both agree to take stock of a family's distinctive dynamics and their giving goals. Also embrace uniqueness. Everybody's different, right? So family philanthropy is unique to each family. And although there's best practices to consider, I think the key is to stay true to a family's authentic giving interests and approaches, as you described the many approaches there were and practices. And define family early, right? Family can take on a different definition when formalizing a family's giving, or establishing a family foundation. And while there's no right or wrong answer to this, and it's important to ask early on as the family grows, what does family mean? What constitutes family and family giving, and who will make the grant making decisions? And finally, we covered eligibility, and it matters. Those requirements matter. And it's important that eligibility serve for a family foundation in terms of considering many factors. For example, we talked about age, relationship to the founder, role in the foundation, level of training we talked about. As you bring in the next generation, consider which factors are the highest priority and define clearly what they entail so everyone starts on an equal playing field as much as possible. So I'd like to turn to, we have several questions here from our audience, and I'd love to be able to answer a few of them. So first, we have for family members who are starting a family foundation, they often have a lot of questions while swimming in an overwhelming pool of information. So to what extent do families employ philanthropic experts to customize resources that fit a family's interests and needs? And we touched on this a little bit. We talked about outside service providers. They can facilitate foundation startup activities and ongoing operations, and they serve as a neutral party in the room to navigate the board dynamics and the transitions that they might be going through. But I think philanthropic advisors, and you mentioned this, can also serve as experts on key topics, and also on establishing governance structure and research and developing program interests, building a grant decision-making structure, training the next generation. Of course, both of our organizations are very equipped to do these things. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about, perhaps if you have any experiences where it has brought in great support to your members.
We've certainly seen it in a number of ways. And I think that, as you've talked about, it can be that person who helps just curate resources, because there's so much information out there. So how do you know what's most relevant to you? So someone can help cull down out of the thousands and thousands of articles, the top 10 that reach you in this moment. I think the other thing that we see families doing is reaching out to be connected with their peers. And by that, often families want to see themselves in the context of other families doing philanthropy. Like, how do we stack up? How do we measure up? How are families like ours tackling this particular problem? And so through networks like NCFP, like the regional associations of grant makers, Exponent Philanthropy, other organizations, we see families both connecting with outside experts as well as their peers to try to benchmark what it is and how they want to move forward on particular issues. So I think it's a combination of things, but I would say that those families who have the capacity to use an outside facilitator, the other role that facilitator can play, quite frankly, is to keep the decisions moving along, because it's easy to get paralyzed by indecision when there's so many decisions in front of you. And so having somebody say, like, this is how we're going to, march through, this is how we're going to make decisions that then will lead to the next decision, can be extraordinarily helpful.
Yeah, it's so key to have that facilitation person in the room a lot of times with keeping things moving and not getting stuck. It's very easy to get stuck sometimes. And as I said, that neutral party sometimes pulls everyone out of that and keeps the objectivity in the room. Another question is, you described, this is something we've touched on. So you described the varying interests and goals of philanthropists across generations of family foundations. However, there are other variations to consider, specifically time. If philanthropy is introduced to young adults when they are of age for board service, philanthropy then competes with their focus on education, work, and family life to the point that these young potential philanthropists lack interest, or they might have interest, but the added activities causes stress. How does one engage a busy next generation? Um, Miki, I'll let you start on that. I have a few thoughts, but
Yeah.
I'll let you take it away first.
I think I obviously have talked about some of those ideas earlier in this
Yep.
webinar. I think the other critical thing to do is ask them. Ask them how much time they actually have and what interests them. I thought you gave a great example of the treasurer of a foundation who brought on someone who was really interested in finance. And so have the conversation about what would be important enough for you to make time for. I think that's always a great starting point.
I want to touch on one of the things that you mentioned earlier too, which was technology. I think that there's some very useful tools for philanthropists who are super busy that can really streamline or facilitate their work. And technology has really shown up at the forefront of that lately. Many of our clients are finding that foundation management technology platforms are making all the difference in how a foundation board member can spend their time. And for them, new technologies are making grants administration and decision-making processes more efficient. I mentioned the online gift certificates. That kind of digital grant making has really facilitated family engagement when there's limited time, but definitely interest in supporting, but just no time to do that more administrative role. And then one of the things that I think we're finding, which is, not technology oriented, but more of a service oriented approach, is the learning. And to be eligible, we're talking about learning about philanthropy and about the foundation. Well, that takes time, and that sometimes can be quite intimidating, especially if you've got that multi-generational family with the curriculum in a book that's so thick. So we found that brief learning sessions like lunch and learns, where you tackle a topic briefly, or you have leadership development sessions, 30 minutes, where, hey, I'm grappling with this question, and let's just brainstorm or bounce ideas off of one another, and have that kind of either one-on-one or group session where everybody's gathering information, but it doesn't feel overwhelming and it is not a drain on time. Everyone's putting food in their mouths at the same time, and it's okay. So just a few ways.
Absolutely.
Okay. And then a favorite question that comes to us often is, can we talk about ways to honor a founder's legacy? And we touched on this a little bit, but maybe we can delve into it a little bit about, continuing that legacy a little bit more, and those, when a founder is really passionate about priorities, passing on those interests to the future generation. We talked about there's many ways to do this. And you mentioned about having any kind of documents, or, there's the video. There's a letter from the founder. We did have one client who read a letter every annual meeting from the founder about what their goals and interests were for the legacy of the foundation. And anyway, to convey the importance of a foundation's history, to be a compelling message for future leaders. And we've been successful in adding in new generations when you're talking about stories of success for giving goals from the founder. Talk about those successful models before they come in, before new generation comes in. And shifts in direction for the next generation. Talk beforehand about what that means. And we touched on that a little bit. Are there any other examples that you can think of where that might have been prevalent, either successful or not?
So I would say, I think you've mentioned a lot of the tools that are out there to help document founders' intent. And I certainly know from the families I've worked with that there's a lot of interest in how do we get started, what mattered to the founding generation. We want to respect that. There's a great respect for donor intent. We see that in the surveys that we've done through our trend studies and such things. I would also say from my own experience in working with donor families that where I've seen the most success is where the intent is clear enough that it's understandable across evolutions in time. It could be rooted in a set of values that are tied to a specific religion, anchoring in Jewish values, anchoring in Catholic values. It can also be around broad themes around education to help people succeed. What I've seen to be challenging for generations to manage is when the intent is defined so very narrowly that it just doesn't fit in with the interests of succeeding generations. And so again, there's can be a sense of disengagement of stewarding a legacy that might be important to you from a familial perspective, but doesn't necessarily meet your own philanthropic passions. And so it can feel a little sterile.
Right.
The flip side is where there's no direction given whatsoever, which can feel paralyzing because there's so many things that you can do.
And that gets back to our original conversation and some of our takeaways about starting early. I mean, really, when you're setting that foundation up, be thinking about that next generation, or just putting on paper some of your goals or interests or passions or what your hopes are for the direction of this organization. You might not know at that moment, but visit it as often as possible so that as life changes, you're remembering that that's a living document. It's a living legacy, essentially, to keep having that on paper, or in video, or however you want to record it, or passing on the stories to your children to be inclusive as much as possible, if that's your wishes. And if not to be inclusive, also to state that. This is, I think, a good point to close and just say it was just a delight to have a conversation with you and to take on some of these many facets of family philanthropy. And we look forward to continuing the conversation through the many questions that have come in, and we will together be sending responses to all those questions. And there will be a recording at the end for anybody who could only see a part of this or unfortunately might have had to miss it. So thank you all for attending, and Miki, thank you for being such a delight to speak with.
Thank you, Robin. It's been fun.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks.